During the same council, the Jesuits were ordered by the Pope to make war silently and openly against the Reformation. And that's exactly what we see them doing. They were opposed to the doctrines of grace, that God saves men whom he has chosen before the foundation of the world, and said that it is man's free will, and that man must cooperate in some manner. I know that Arminians would strongly disagree that this is what they believe. However, when we look at history and when we look at the facts, we can see that it tells a completely different story. When the papers of Archbishop Laud, a self-confessed Jesuit, were examined, this letter was found among them. Dated March 1628, a Jesuit's letter sent to the rector at Brussels about the ensuing parliament. Now, the design of this letter was to give the superior of the Jesuits, then resident at Brussels, an account of the posture of civil and ecclesiastical affairs in England. Here is an extract of that letter. Father Rector, let not the damp of astonishment seize upon your ardent and zealous soul in apprehending the unexpected calling of a parliament. We have now strings to our bow. We have planted that sovereign drug, Arminianism, which we hope will purge the Protestants from their heresy. And it flourisheth and bears fruit in due season. For the better prevention of the Puritans, the Arminians have already locked up the Duke of Buckingham's ears, and we have those of our own religion which stand continually at the Duke's chamber to see who goes in and out. We cannot be too circumspect and careful in this regard. I am at this time transported with joy to see how happily all instruments and means, as well as lesser, cooperate unto our purposes. But to return unto the main fabric, our foundation is Arminianism. The Arminians and projectors, as it appears in the premises, affect mutation. This we second and enforce by probable arguments. That's taken by from Hidden Works of Darkness, page 89 and 19. For more about this, please see the link to an article entitled Arminianism, The Road to Rome. From this we can see quite clearly that the Jesuits believed that Arminianism was a drug that they had planted into Protestantism to undermine the beliefs which they call heresy, and that it will bear fruit in due season, and it's to undermine the Puritans, who held to, of course, the doctrines of grace. And, of course, they even talk about undermining the Duke of Buckingham, so undermining the government, the constitutional system of England at the time. And this is to affect mutation, so this is to alter Christianity to their end. Now, if you're a Christian and you're watching this video and you've never even heard of Arminianism, it's likely that you are probably going to be an Arminian because, well, most Christians today actually are. So I'd invite you just to please continue listening before you examine any of the links I'll post. Now, the doctrines that Luther was defending against the attack of the Papists, they are typically called Calvinism. Although, like Charles Spurgeon, I don't really feel that this term is correct. These biblical concepts are often called the doctrines of grace. Now, to quote Spurgeon, the doctrines of original sin, election, effectual calling, final perseverance, and all those great truths which are called Calvinism, though Calvin was not the author of them, but simply an able writer and preacher upon the subject, are, I believe, the essential doctrines of the gospel that is in Jesus Christ. However, the Counter-Reformation was a success, and the doctrines that the Jesuits sought to undermine have all but disappeared here in the UK, where I live. When the doctrines of grace are preached, they are typically promulgated by false teachers in the US, mixing God's sovereignty with other teachings given them and invented by the Jesuits. I can think of, just as an example, John MacArthur. John MacArthur is upheld as some great hero of what is called Calvinism. However, the man, by any observation, appears to hold to futurism and dispensationalism. Don't worry if you're not familiar with those terms. I will expound upon what they mean and show you exactly where they come from now. Now, I've said that you will know the Jesuits by their fruits. But what of the fruits of Arminianism, which Lord said Arminianism said that it would bear in due season? Before this is fully examined, we have to expose another doctrine held, again, by the vast majority of supposedly Protestant Christianity today. Now we'll look at futurism. I mentioned futurism. I mentioned dispensationalism. Let's look at the book of Revelation now. Let's look at eschatology, because this is very important in showing the means and ends of the Jesuits and just how powerful they have been in undermining Protestant Christianity. Now, like I said before, if you haven't heard of Arminianism, well, actually it probably turns out that being a Christian today, you probably are an Arminian, and you had no idea. Similarly, you may very well go to a church that teaches some kind of futurism. I'll just expound on what I mean by that. There are typically 4 different ways of interpreting the book of Revelation of Jesus Christ. The preterist view says that the book of Revelation has already been fulfilled in the past. Now, this view is often held to by Romanists, the papists, and this was developed by a Jesuit priest named Louis de Alcazar. The second is as follows. Now, I'm just going to quote extensively from Wikipedia here, as any good scholar would. But before I do so, I should point out that at the time of the Reformation, for a few hundred years after, and indeed to many pre-Reformation reformers, it was entirely apparent that the papacy was the Antichrist. I'm not going to present an argument in this video for that here, but for more information on that, on how the view became apparent and whether it is so, please see the links in the description box. I very strongly recommend that you do research this and examine this and pray about that. Now back to Wiki and the second way of interpreting Revelation. The view of futurism, a product of the Counter-Reformation, was advanced beginning in the 16th century in response to the identification of the papacy as Antichrist. Francisco Ribera, remember that name, a Jesuit priest, developed this theory in Sacram Beati Ionis Apostoli and Evangelistiae Apocalypsin Commentari, his 1585 treatise on the Apocalypse of John. And Saint Bellarmine, remember that name as well, codified this view, giving in full the Catholic theory set forth by the Greek and Latin fathers of a personal Antichrist to come just before the end of the world, and to be accepted by the Jews, and enthroned in the temple at Jerusalem, thus endeavouring to dispose of the exposition which saw Antichrist in the Pope. Most premillennial dispensationalists now accept Bellarmine's interpretation in modified form. Widespread Protestant identification of the papacy as the Antichrist persisted in the USA until the early 1900s, when the Scofield Reference Bible was published by Cyrus Scofield. This commentary promoted futurism, causing a decline in the Protestant identification of the papacy as Antichrist. Some US futurists hold that sometime prior to the expected return of Jesus, there will be a period of great tribulation, during which the Antichrist, indwelt and controlled by Satan, will attempt to win supporters with false peace and supernatural signs. He will silence all that defy him by refusing to receive his mark on their right hands or forehead. This mark will be required to legally partake in the end-time economic system. Some futurists believe that the Antichrist will be assassinated halfway through the tribulation, being revived and indwelt by Satan. The Antichrist will continue on for 3.5 years following this deadly wound. In 1590, Ribera published a commentary on the Revelation as a counter-interpretation to the prevailing view among Protestants, which identified the papacy with the Antichrist. Ribera applied all of Revelation, but the earliest chapters, to the end time, rather than to the history of the Church. Antichrist would be a single evil person who would be received by the Jews and would rebuild Jerusalem. That quote in particular comes from George Eldon Ladd in The Blessed Hope, a biblical study of the Second Advent and Rapture. Now, another quote here is, Ribera denied the Protestant scriptural Antichrist. That comes from 2 Thessalonians 2, as seated in the Church of God. He set on an infidel Antichrist outside the Church of God. That quote is by Ralph Thompson. The result of his work, Ribera's work, was a twisting and maligning of prophetic truth, according to Robert Carangola. So what I'm getting at with these quotes here is that basically 1,500 years of prophetic history was just swept under the proverbial rug. And how could that possibly happen? Well, you see, the Jesuits had added the infamous gap. They added something called the gap theory that teaches that when Rome fell in 70 AD, prophecy just stopped. And it would only continue again right around the time of the commonly held to secret rapture. Thus the 10 horns, the little horn, the beast, and the Antichrist have nothing to do with Christians today. According to this viewpoint, absolutely no prophecies were fulfilled during the Dark Ages, or during all these massively momentous occasions in man's history that have occurred and will continue to occur until the dispensationalists and the papists, for instance, agree that the rapture will then, the tribulation will then start at 7 years at the end of time. You can probably tell that I don't agree with that view by now.